The year is 1912. Deep inside the heavily guarded vaults of the United States Treasury in Washington, a terrifying financial reality is hiding in plain sight. The American government is presiding over the fastest-growing industrial empire in the Western Hemisphere, yet its official income tax rate sits at exactly 0%. Not a single factory worker, not a single steel baron, and not a single railroad tycoon pays a direct federal tax on their immense daily earnings. To a modern civilian observer, this might sound like a capitalist utopia, but to a military logistician or a naval strategist, this was a ticking time bomb of unprecedented proportions. How does a nation build a global war machine, maintain a standing army, and construct a modern steel navy without tapping into the domestic wealth of its own population? The answer reveals a logistical system so fundamentally fragile that a single, well-coordinated enemy action could have completely bankrupted the United States government in a matter of weeks. This is not merely a historical review of taxation. This is a strict forensic audit of America's pre-war logistical nightmare. It is the story of how the United States funded its borders before the invention of its ultimate financial weapon, and why this archaic system almost cost them their seat at the table of global superpowers. To understand the sheer danger of the American financial posture before 1913, we must first look at the Federal Ledger. If you open the accounting books of the U.S. Treasury from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, you will not find revenue streams designed to sustain total war. Instead, you will find a government entirely dependent on a concept known as the tariff trap. More than 90% of all federal revenue came from just two sources. The first was customs duties, also known as tariffs, which were taxes placed on imported foreign goods arriving at American seaports. The second was excise taxes, which were essentially domestic sin taxes levied almost exclusively on the sale of tobacco and distilled spirits like whiskey. Let that logistical logic sink in for a moment. The survival of the United States federal government, the funding of its military outposts, and the wages of its soldiers relied completely on two things. First, that American citizens continued to purchase massive quantities of European manufactured goods. Second, that American citizens continued to smoke heavily and drink massive amounts of alcohol. It was a moral and strategic paradox of the highest order. If a temperance movement succeeded in stopping Americans from drinking whiskey, the United States Army would face immediate funding shortages. But the far more dangerous vulnerability lay at the customs houses of New York, Boston, and Charleston. Because the government relied on tariffs for the vast majority of its operating budget, the entire federal apparatus was physically chained to the coastline. Every dollar that kept the lights on in Washington had to float across the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean first. This created a fatal doctrine blind spot in American strategic thinking. For decades, American politicians had comforted themselves with the illusion of free geographical security. They believed that with the Atlantic Ocean to the east and the Pacific Ocean to the west, the homeland was completely invulnerable to a European invasion. They were entirely focused on the physical impossibility of landing a massive foreign army on American soil, but they failed to recognize that their financial logistics were completely naked and exposed to any hostile navy. Let us run a theoretical battlefield simulation from the perspective of the British Royal Navy or the German Kaiserliche Marine in the year 1910. An enemy commander would not need to land a single infantryman on the beaches of Virginia to defeat the United States. They would not need to march on Washington or burn the White House. All a hostile European power had to do was deploy a modern dreadnought fleet to blockade the primary commercial ports of the American East Coast. By simply parking a wall of steel ships outside New York Harbor and stopping international merchant vessels from entering, the enemy would instantly cut off the lifeblood of the American treasury. With no foreign goods arriving, no tariffs could be collected. With no tariffs collected, the federal budget would collapse within a single fiscal quarter. The United States government would be completely paralyzed, unable to pay its troops, unable to buy ammunition, and unable to fund the very navy it needed to break the blockade. It was a catastrophic mechanical failure, built directly into the nation's balance sheet. The American economy might have been producing millions of tons of steel and coal internally, but the federal government had no legal mechanism to extract that domestic wealth to defend itself. The wealth was locked behind the factory gates, completely inaccessible to the Department of War. This was the reality of the pre-1913 United States. It was a colossus with feet of clay, boasting the largest internal economy in the world, but operating with the fragile tax structure of an 18th-century island colony. European military intelligence officers looking at the American ledger knew exactly what they were seeing. They saw a nation that could not afford a prolonged modern conflict. They saw a country that could be starved of federal capital without firing a shot inland. This arrogant assumption by foreign powers was entirely mathematically correct, based on the rules of the Old World. But the rules of the Old World were about to be shredded by the relentless mechanical evolution of modern warfare. The Industrial Revolution had changed the cost of lethality. War was no longer fought by men with muskets eating salted pork and marching on foot. The 20th century was introducing a new era of mechanized slaughter, and the price tag for this new type of violence was growing exponentially. The American government was about to slam headfirst into a mathematical crisis. They were about to realize that you cannot fund a modern, two-ocean superpower on the backs of imported silk and taxed whiskey. The illusion of free security was over. The era of the dreadnought had arrived, and the United States needed a new financial weapon to survive it. The year 1906 shattered the American illusion completely. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the British Royal Navy launched the HMS Dreadnought. It was a revolutionary steel leviathan that instantly rendered every other warship on the planet functionally obsolete. For the defense auditors in Washington, the Dreadnought was not just an engineering marvel, it was a terrifying financial nightmare. The era of wooden frigates, cheap canvas sails, and smoothbore cannons was dead forever. The new currency of global maritime power was forged in heavy Krupp armor plating, complex steam turbines, and massive 12-inch naval rifles. To maintain the Monroe Doctrine and protect two vast, separated coastlines, the United States Navy desperately needed to build its own dreadnought fleet. But the mathematics of this new industrialized arms race were fundamentally incompatible with the American tax code. Let us examine the strict mechanical cost of this modernization. Building a single modern battleship in the early 20th century required an unprecedented concentration of capital. You had to mine the iron ore in Minnesota, transport it across the Great Lakes, smelt the steel in Pennsylvania, forge the heavy armor, and assemble the massive hull in specialized coastal dry docks. You needed to pay thousands of highly skilled riveters, electrical engineers, and metallurgists. Every single dreadnought cost millions of dollars in federal funds before it even fired a practice shot. Now, compare that staggering mechanical expense to the federal revenue system of the time. The United States government was trying to fund a two-ocean steel navy by taxing imported silk shirts from France and domestic cigars from Virginia. It was a mathematical impossibility. The admirals of the Navy Department could run the numbers themselves, and the results were always grim. If the military requested a fleet of 10 new battleships to counter European expansion, the Treasury Department would essentially have to hope that American citizens suddenly decided to double their consumption of whiskey just to pay for the steel. This was the absurd logistical paradox of the rising American empire. The national defense was literally being funded by the recreational vices of its own civilian population. If a widespread social movement successfully campaigned for temperance and stopped alcohol sales, the military budget would be decimated overnight. No sober nation could afford a modern mechanized navy under this archaic system. Furthermore, relying on import tariffs to build warships created a vicious, self-defeating cycle. To build the ships required to protect the international trade routes, you had to aggressively tax those very same trade routes. If those trade routes were ever disrupted by a foreign naval power, you could no longer afford the ships to defend them. The United States was trapped in a financial feedback loop that practically guaranteed its defeat in any prolonged global conflict. Foreign military observers understood this vulnerability perfectly. The German General Staff, a body of men highly analytical and obsessed with logistics, knew that American industrial output was massive, but they also knew that this output was strictly privatized. The federal government had no legal mechanism to harness the staggering wealth of Andrew Carnegie's steel mills, J.P. Morgan's banks, or John D. Rockefeller's oil refineries. To the empires of Europe, America was a giant, with its hands tied firmly behind its back. The nation could produce endless resources, but the government in Washington could not legally mobilize those resources for war. The federal ledger was completely disconnected from the actual gross domestic product of the country. This mechanical crisis reached a boiling point as global tensions rapidly escalated toward 1914. The cost of mechanized warfare was growing at an exponential rate, far outpacing the slow growth of tariff revenues. Rapid-fire machine guns, motorized transport trucks, and eventually combat airplanes were entering the military equation. The price tag for equipping, feeding, and transporting a single infantry division was skyrocketing beyond anything seen in the 19th century. The old system of relying on coastal customs houses and tax stamps glued to whiskey barrels was collapsing under the crushing weight of the 20th century. A new kind of conflict was looming on the horizon, one that would require the total mobilization of society. Total war demands total taxation. A nation cannot fight a mechanized global war using a peacetime financial system designed for an isolationist republic. The defense planners and treasury officials realized that if the United States did not radically alter its financial architecture, it would be relegated to the sidelines of history. They needed a reliable mechanism to bypass the fragile global sea trade completely. They needed to tap directly into the beating heart of American domestic industry. They needed a robust financial weapon capable of funding a war machine on a scale the world had never before seen. And in the pivotal year of 1913, just months before the world caught fire, they finally forged it. In the year 1913, the United States Congress passed the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. Shortly after, they enacted the Revenue Act of 1913. To the average civilian, this was a mundane piece of economic legislation, but to the forensic auditors of the War Department, this was the equivalent of discovering a limitless energy source. The United States government had finally secured the legal authority to bypass the fragile seaports and directly tax the personal income of its citizens. They had created Form 1040, the very first federal income tax return. This single piece of paper was arguably the most destructive weapon ever introduced into the American arsenal. It was a bureaucratic mechanism designed to systematically harvest the financial energy of a rapidly industrializing nation. At its inception, this tax was incredibly narrow in its scope. It primarily targeted the extreme upper class, the top 1% of the wealthiest individuals in the country. The initial rates were astronomically low by modern standards, sitting between just 1 and 7%. But the initial percentage was not the point. The strategic victory was the establishment of the bureaucratic pipeline itself. The government had successfully installed a financial valve into the beating heart of the American industrial powerhouse. They no longer had to wait for European merchant ships to arrive in New York Harbor to fund the United States Army. They could now directly tap into the staggering profits of Andrew Carnegie's steel empire. They could extract capital directly from the immense railroad networks spanning the continent. They could tax the massive coal mines of Appalachia and the booming automotive factories in Detroit. This was not merely a system of internal tax collection. This was the unlocking of the ultimate wartime arsenal. It was a logistical masterstroke that fundamentally altered the balance of global military power. To understand the sheer magnitude of this shift, we must look at what happened exactly 1 year later. In the summer of 1914, the continent of Europe exploded into the First World War. The exact nightmare scenario that American naval strategists had feared for decades suddenly became a terrifying reality. Global maritime trade completely collapsed almost overnight. The British Royal Navy established a suffocating naval blockade against the German Empire. German U-boats began aggressively sinking merchant vessels across the Atlantic Ocean. International shipping lanes instantly became active war zones. Because of this massive global disruption, the importation of foreign goods into the United States plummeted dramatically. And just as the mathematical models had predicted, American tariff revenues completely evaporated. If the United States had entered the year 1914 relying solely on the old system of customs duties and whiskey taxes, the federal government would have faced catastrophic insolvency. They would have been entirely bankrupt at the exact moment the world descended into total mechanized war. They would have had absolutely no financial capacity to expand the military, build new coastal defenses, or stockpile critical artillery ammunition. The illusion of free security would have ended in a humiliating economic collapse. But because the Revenue Act of 1913 had been activated just months prior, the American government possessed a massive financial shock absorber. The timing of this legislation was almost unnervingly perfect. As the tariff revenue flatlined on the federal ledger, the new Internal Revenue System was rapidly scaled up to replace it. The pipeline that was initially designed to tax only the top 1% was quickly expanded by Congress to capture a broader segment of the population. The tax rates were adjusted aggressively upward, turning the initial trickle of domestic revenue into an unstoppable flood of federal capital. The United States was no longer bound by the fatal limits of global sea trade. It was now entirely powered by the immense, untouchable wealth generated safely within its own borders. This moment marked the true genesis of the American military-industrial complex. When the United States formally entered the First World War in 1917, they did not have to panic about how to pay for it. The federal ledger had already been fundamentally restructured to absorb the astronomical costs of modern warfare. They could now afford to mass-produce millions of high-explosive artillery shells, tens of thousands of heavy machine guns, and outfit an expeditionary force of over 2 million men. They funded this unprecedented national mobilization through a combination of Liberty bonds and rapidly escalating income taxes. The top marginal tax rate eventually skyrocketed to an astonishing 77% to feed the insatiable war machine. The American citizens were no longer just providing raw manpower to the front lines in France. They were mathematically underwriting the systematic destruction of the Central Powers through their daily domestic labor. This was a terrifying realization for the military intelligence officers of the German High Command. They were witnessing a nation that could convert raw domestic capitalism directly into high-explosive ordnance at a terrifying speed. The old metrics of assessing a rival nation's military strength were completely obsolete. You could no longer just count the number of active infantrymen or the number of dreadnoughts parked in a harbor. You had to calculate the total taxable industrial output of the entire civilian population, and by that strict mathematical metric, the United States had instantly become a strategic monster. The blueprint forged in 1913 proved definitively that total war requires a total synchronization of the national economy. It proved that modern battles are not just won by the tactical brilliance of generals on a muddy field. They are won by the cold, relentless efficiency of defense auditors and tax collectors operating safely in the capital. The new financial weapon had been successfully tested in the bloody crucible of the First World War, but its true, world-ending potential would not be fully realized until exactly 2 decades later. The logistical foundation had been poured and set in concrete. The bureaucratic pipeline was built, thoroughly tested, and waiting patiently. And when the Axis powers made their fatal strategic miscalculations in the late 1930s, they did not realize what they were actually awakening. They were not just declaring war on a standing army or a fleet of warships. They were declaring war on the most efficient, legally fortified wealth extraction engine ever constructed in human history. When the Second World War erupted in 1939, the Axis powers made the greatest intelligence failure of the 20th century. Adolf Hitler and the German High Command looked across the Atlantic Ocean and saw a militarily weak nation. In 1939, the United States Army was ranked 17th in the world, positioned just behind the Army of Romania. The Japanese Imperial Navy similarly believed they could secure the entire Pacific before the Americans could physically and financially mobilize. The Axis analysts were counting physical tanks, active infantrymen, and existing warships. They completely ignored the invisible, bureaucratic leviathan that had been quietly maturing since 1913. The American federal government no longer relied on the fragile arrival of merchant ships or the domestic sale of whiskey. They possessed the most sophisticated, high-volume wealth extraction engine on the planet. The Form 1040 had become the ultimate weapon of mass production. As soon as the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941, the United States did not just declare war. They unleashed the full, terrifying mathematical weight of their new tax code upon the Axis powers. To understand how utterly doomed Germany and Japan were, from a strict forensic standpoint, we only need to look at the wartime balance sheet. In the years leading up to 1913, the entire federal budget hovered around $700 million. By 1945, The United States government was spending over $80 billion a year. They were literally outspending the combined gross domestic product of their enemies. This astronomical surge in military capital was not magic. It was the direct result of the income tax system being rapidly expanded to cover almost the entire American workforce. In 1939, fewer than 4 million Americans filed an income tax return. By the end of the war in 1945, nearly 43 million citizens were paying direct taxes to feed the arsenal of democracy. To make this system even more ruthlessly efficient, the government fundamentally changed how taxes were collected. They realized that waiting until the end of the year to collect revenue was too slow to fund a two-ocean war. So, in 1943, the government passed the Current Tax Payment Act. This law introduced the concept of automatic tax withholding. The federal government began extracting the capital directly from a factory worker's paycheck before the citizen even held the money in their hands. It was the ultimate streamlining of war logistics, turning every civilian paycheck into an immediate deposit for bullets, rations, and aviation fuel. The Treasury Department even enlisted Hollywood and Walt Disney to produce animated propaganda films featuring Donald Duck, convincing the American public that paying their new income tax was their most vital patriotic duty. And the public complied, pouring an ocean of money into a military-industrial complex that simply could not be mathematically defeated. This was the logistical bedrock that built over 300,000 combat aircraft in less than 4 years. It was the financial pipeline that constructed nearly 90,000 tanks and thousands of steel naval vessels. It funded the massive Lend-Lease program, which kept the British Empire afloat and provided the Soviet Red Army with the trucks, radios, and boots they desperately needed to push the Germans all the way back to Berlin. Even the Manhattan Project, the most expensive and secretive scientific endeavor in human history, was quietly absorbed into this massive federal budget without bankrupting the nation. The Axis powers had prepared for a traditional military conflict. They had not prepared for an accounting war against an industrialized continent that could instantly convert the daily wages of its citizens into high-explosive ordnance. The German Tiger tanks were engineering marvels, but they were built by a fractured, debt-ridden economy relying on plundered European resources. The American Sherman tanks were built by a stable, hyper-efficient tax system that could replace a destroyed tank on the battlefield before the smoke even cleared. This is the cold, forensic verdict of the Second World War. Courage, tactical brilliance, and superior training are absolutely vital on the battlefield. But in the era of total mechanized war, those virtues are useless without a logistical system capable of sustaining them. The United States did not just fight the Axis powers, they audited them out of existence. They buried their enemies under a mountain of steel, funded by a piece of tax legislation that was signed 30 years earlier by men who could not have possibly imagined the global firestorm that was coming. However, we must always remember the true nature of this terrifying machine. A well-designed tax code can build 1 million rifles, but it cannot pull the trigger. A massive federal budget can construct a fleet of landing craft, but it cannot bleed on the black sands of Iwo Jima or freeze in the forests of Bastogne. The financial weapon forged in 1913 only worked because millions of young men were willing to wield the physical weapons it purchased, often paying the ultimate, untaxable price. The system merely provided the tools. The human beings provided the sacrifice. If you have family members who contributed to this massive wartime economy, whether by fighting on the front lines or building bombers in the factories at home, I want to hear their stories in the comments below. Understanding the logistics of history is how we uncover the truth behind the myths of warfare. If you appreciate this kind of deep, forensic military analysis, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We will continue to break down the hidden systems, the misunderstood weapons, and the cold mathematics that actually decided the fate of the 20th century. The deadliest weapon of World War II was not dropped from an airplane. It was filed in triplicate by a defense auditor in Washington.